All right, today we're going to talk about one-point perspective. When we use perspective in our drawings, it's just a way to take something that is drawn flat and make it look three-dimensional. When we're talking about one-point perspective, things will appear to get smaller as they get further away, and they converge toward a single vanishing point on the horizon line. Illustrator has some very easy tools that make it pretty easy to do perspective. So if we go under View, Perspective Grid, and you go to a one-point perspective, and if you just click this default like one-point normal view, this brings up a one-point perspective grid. If at any time you don't want to look at this grid, you can just go right back under View to Perspective Grid, and you can hide the grid. Okay. But along with this are two tools in Illustrator. So we have the Perspective Selection tool and the Perspective Grid tool. Let's talk a little bit about the Perspective Grid tool. There are lots of anchor points when we use the grid tool, and this grid tool is strictly just to set up your grid that you want to use for your perspective drawing. Okay, so this right here is the horizon line. Okay, so this is the vanishing point. So this is where everything converges and disappears, is right to this line. So you can grab either the right or the left anchor point, and when you pull it up or down, that's going to change your perspective on what you're seeing. Okay. We also have the origin point. So this kind of, like center kind of circle right here in the middle is the origin. And so when you think of where objects are on the X and Y axis, that's where your X and Y numbers are going to be coming from. This is kind of like your 0 point, okay? And then from there, like just above the origin point, this will control the size of your grid. So as I move it closer to my horizon line, my grid gets larger. As I move it closer to my origin point, the grid gets smaller. I can adjust the ground level. So this will actually move my entire grid around, but this is my ground level, so I can pull the ground level down, move it around, okay? Again, if you kind of want to arrange, this will let me adjust the left grid. So if I want to control where it is in my drawing, that will do it. Then this would go up. Keep in mind that just because you don't see the grid up here or on the right-hand side, it does still exist. It doesn't show it to you, the horizontal top and bottom, or the left and right grid in a one-point perspective grid. This right here allows you to adjust your the extent of your grid. So as I pull this away, my grid gets longer. As I pull it in this way, you can see my grid gets shorter. Again, it doesn't mean that there's no grid in here. The grid is still there. You're just not seeing it. There is a point when I pull this in where the grid stops. And that's just due to the size, right? So if it kept drawing lines, they get too small to a point where it's all going to look like a solid color. And so the grid still exists in there. You're just not going to see it. Okay, so those are the basics for getting around the grid and making the grid the way you want it. If you have a grid that you want to be able to reuse again, once you've created this, you can go back under here to Perspective Grid, and you can save this grid as a preset in here. So then it can be reused over and over and over again. Okay, I like to leave Snap to Grid on because I like to, when I'm drawing objects, that it's going to snap to this. If I want to see rulers, you can turn your rulers on right here. And if you want to lock the grid, you can lock the grid. Pretty much I use the grid tool to get my grid set up, and then I'm done with it. So If I come back over here to the perspective selection tool, this is the tool that I'll now be using. And you'll notice that my grid anchor points disappear. Okay, the other important part of perspective grid is this little widget right here. And if I would double click any of these perspective tools, it brings me to my grid options. And you want to check show active plane widget. That's what this is right here. I like to leave it just in the default top left because I don't typically have anything there, so it doesn't get in the way. But you can change the position. You can do it top right, bottom left, or bottom right, depending on what works best for your workflow. Okay, so the colors on this widget are talking about the same colors as our guides here. So right here, if I hover over that blue section of that cube, it says left grid, and then in parentheses, it has the number 1. Well, that 1 is the keyboard shortcut to access the left grid. So blue, blue. If I click on the bottom part of the cube, green, green. Okay, and the keyboard shortcut for the bottom of the grid is the number 2. There is not a right-hand side of the grid. There's no right grid in 1-point perspective, so that just is a default to no active grid. And then the white, or the circle on the outside of the cube is also no active grid. So if I click on that, it becomes cyan, and you can see the keyboard shortcut for that is the number 4. So when I don't have an active grid in here, that means that if I draw things, they will draw as flat objects on my artboard like I would expect them to. Okay. If I am in an active plane, I'm going to hit my 1 key on my keyboard, and you'll notice that now I have the left grid selected. And so with my rectangle tool, when I click and drag in here, it's actually creating a shape in the left grid using the perspective as a guide. So you'll notice that this is not a rectangle because it is going to get smaller as it gets closer to that horizon line. If I want to adjust the size of the shape, I use my perspective selection tool, okay, which is a Shift V. And I can resize this, and it will just snap right to the grid depending on, whatever size I want it to be. It won't snap up here because I don't have anything up there, but you get the idea. Okay. If I would just use the regular selection tool on this and I select it and I resize it, it loses all of the perspective. So I know it's a habit to go back to that selection tool, but when you're working in perspective, you cannot use the selection tool on your perspective objects. Okay, so I'm going to Command Z to undo that. So I'm going to pull up my color palette. I'm just going to kind of give us a little bit of color on here, a little bit easier to see what's going on. So I just drew that rectangle in here. I'm going to do back to my Shift V because that's my keyboard shortcut for my perspective selection tool. And now I'm going to hit the letter or the number 2 on my keyboard. So now you can see I have the horizontal grid is the active grid in my perspective drawing now. So now if I go to M for my rectangle tool, I can click and drag to create a shape down here at the bottom. So I'll just add a little bit of black to that shape just to kind of have it just to show a little dimension to it, right? So the sun must be coming from the right and hitting, here, and then I have a little bit of shadow that's coming in here. So I have 2 planes set up right now. If I wanted to continue this around with the horizontal grid selected here, I could create a top plane as well. So I'll hit M, and I'll kind of tend to work my top down. Again, not that big of a deal like how strange it is because I just do my Shift V for my perspective selection tool, right? And I can make adjustments, zoom out, grab that, kind of snap it back in where I'm kind of guessing about right there, right? Actually, probably would want to extend out here a little bit more. We can adjust that later. And I'm going to just kind of adjust the shading on that a little bit. So take my black down just so it's a little bit different to see that plane. I'm going to hit 1 again to go to my left grid. And I know that it's thinking it's my left grid, but it still will put over here, like kind of that plane, the size of the plane. So I'm going to draw this way to get the right-hand side of this plane. So Shift V for my perspective selection tool. It's going to grab it, snap it in. Yeah, definitely not a very square one I have here, right? So whether I'm high there or short here, it is what it is. And I can bring that down a little bit as well. So I could pop this up so it goes to my artboard at least. And I can pull this one out if I wanted to a little bit more as well. I mean, I could actually extend it all the way off the artboard if I wanted to, right? And that way I have some bleed on this document. I don't have to worry about anything not having enough bleed or having kind of white lapsing into there. So this is just kind of a shape of an interior of something, right? Could be a room, it could be whatever. I could make this the sky. I could make this a building color, right? Could do kind of something a little bit brown. I could make this black. I could make this a gray color for a different type of a building, right? And so now I've just moved to outside. Add some clouds into my sky. I'd be ready to go, right? Oh, it looks like I've got a little bit of a gap here. So I can start drawing into this shape to kind of create some objects. So like really, let's see if I want this to be a building that's over here. And I'll just use this grid to do it. So I'm going to hit 1 on my keyboard to activate the left plane again. Okay, that left grid. M for my rectangle tool. And if I just drew, you know, a rectangle over here and I can make it a little bit of a darker color, right? And let's make it a skyscraper with some windows. So maybe I'll use, you know, this as a guide for a window. And Shift V again to kind of, I didn't do the best at that. Make it a different color. And watch this. I can Option drag it down. And as I Option drag it down, oops, use the right tools here, not Shift, use Option. So Option, as I drag, obviously makes a copy. Make sure you're not grabbing the anchor points like I am right there. Let me zoom in a little bit easier, make it a little bit easier to see. There we go. So Option drag makes a copy. And I can create a bunch of windows pretty darn quickly that are all in perspective. And actually, maybe I don't want that to be a window. Maybe I want this to be a door, right? Okay, I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to grab these, holding the Shift key to select multiple objects. And I'm going to Option drag this in to create another set of windows. Look at that. Look how quick and easy that was to get that to go. Oh, maybe I'm off a little bit, right? Now it's kind of like an every other kind of thing. So maybe I reselect these. And I pull them up a grid. And maybe I just don't want that one, and maybe I don't want that one, right? Okay, so pretty easy to create, you know, a perspective drawing pretty quickly. And let me tell you, you can go into as much detail as you want on this too, right? So let's say I want there to be a windowsill in here. So if we look at our angle, like where we are on this window, if I'm standing here in this perspective looking at this windowsill, it's going to look very different up here than it is down here from my eye level, right? So here most likely I'm not going to see much of the bottom of that windowsill, but up here I'm going to see a lot of the bottom of the windowsill and of course none of the top. So where I start with making this windowsill does make a difference as to what it's going to look like, right? If I start with my grid in the left plane and I'm drawing the front of this windowsill, I'm not sure where that just went, like snapped up really small. Okay, there you go. This can be right, that front part of that windowsill, make it a little bit lighter so we can kind of see what's happening there. Okay, so that is going to kind of show that inside part and gives that window a little bit more dimension, right, by drawing that extra one into there. So it's really easy. And again, if I zoom in on this then too, I could do the same thing where I just option drag it up, right? And I can keep, and as I move it, I'm going to need to adjust like kind of where it is in there and probably make it a little bit smaller. But it's an easy way to kind of add a little bit more dimension into there. Now, what if I want this to stick out with a sign? Or maybe even like an awning kind of a thing that comes over the top of the doorway here. So if I wanted some type of a, like an awning type of a thing, or then I can put this on my horizontal grid as I draw a rectangle. Right? And maybe I want it to be a little bit more centered. So I'm going to kind of bring it up over here a little bit more. And now I want to draw into the sides, right? So this is obviously going to be my left plane. So I'll grab that left plane. You know, what's that drop down kind of a color going to be? And then the front plane is a little bit different. That is going to be a no plane. So if I hit this no plane area with my perspective selection tool, that would be just kind of a regular, right? It's not in a plane because it's on the front of this. I'll add a little bit of color to that as well. And you can do the same thing, like, you know, if I wanted to put a column in here, I could throw a column into there. And let's just say, oh, you know, I want to put some type of sign up here with all these skyscrapers, right? They have these signages everywhere. So I can stay in my like the flat artboard area of my artboard, and I could maybe just come over here on the side and let's just make let me make just a sign here. So I'm gonna, well, maybe I don't need a rectangle. I'll just do some text. Let's do some text and bring this point size down. Maybe we'll just call it like hotel. Okay, so I can type in some text, and honestly, I could even, you know, I can draw shapes into this. I could use like my brush tool to kind of, you know, put some type of a, you know, color kind of a thing to this. We'll send it to the back. I know this is pretty boring, but you guys will get the idea. So I can grab these objects, right? Select them. I could group them ahead of time too if I wanted to group them. Go back to my perspective selection tool. And as I start pulling it in, I'm going to hit the 1 key if I want it to be on the 1 plane, which would put it like on my building. If I hit 2, it would put it flat. And then I could lay it down on my on the flat roof, right? Ooh, but it's not turning the right way. So if I wanted it, and look at what it did to that brush slash, the little brush stroke that I did really did not work well at all in this type of a graphic. So I think I'm just going to delete that. But there is my hotel graphic. And again, I want to go back to my perspective selection tool. If you notice, I'm kind of limited here with my with what I can do. If I come over here, I don't have any rotate tools, right? There's no way to kind of flip it around. So if I want to rotate this in my scene, I'm going to Command Z, put it back to this. Let's go ahead and let's rotate this here. Before I pull it in. So I'm going to grab my perspective selection tool, hit 2 on my keyboard, and now you'll see that it's rotated. And again, make sure to have the perspective selection tool on here, right? I can make this larger, make sure when if you're scaling that you're actually, oops, I just flipped it. You're holding the shift key so that you're constraining your, the scale. It's not that you're distorting it. And then I can reposition it where I want it to be. But now I have that perspective built into that grid with that message on that, the roof or the top of that object. And it could be a sign that sticks out, right? It could be just about anything. If I wanted to put in a, like, oh, this is the middle of the road, let's just put a line in here. And I'm going to put a stroke on it that's kind of that, orangey yellow color. I'll up the stroke, right? I'll go to my stroke in here. I'll tell it to be a dashed line. And I can adjust that, like it's a little too thick, right? So there's the middle of that. I can put sidewalks in here. I can put curbs in here. So again, 2, hit M. Oh, it's remembering my nice stroked object here. I'm just going to pull that in, and if I want it to go all the way out, right, I can select that, take it to, again, not my stroke, make sure I'm doing it to my fill. All right, and there would be, start of a sidewalk. You can add a curb into there as you're going through. So this is just an introduction to one-point perspective for you. And I want you to create a one-point perspective of some sort for this week's exercise. Have some fun.